Live now.
Welcome to the Foundation TSC meeting for August 30th, 2017. Just for those watching, I will note that this is the first meeting following a PR which, remerged the core technical committee and the TSC back together. So, this is officially. We're gonna. I think the current plan is to use the slot from the CTC meetings as the ongoing meetings for the basically combined group of the TSC and CTC. Starting this week because it was already scheduled with the issues that are on the CTC agenda, and then over the next little while we'll have to figure out how we merge all the TSC business back into this meeting as well. So in terms of the agenda, I guess we have a number of issues. The first one is, and I'll start maybe in reverse order, is issue 165. We've had a report requesting that one of our members step down. The CTC does need to, CTC/TSC, sorry, needs to, discuss that internally, figure out what we believe the best options are, and we're planning to do that in a document that will be shared among the members and editable by everybody. And really, that's our next step on that issue. Unless anybody else wants to add anything this week. Okay, if not, I suggest we move on to the next item on the agenda, which is Node.js Node promises more robust stringification 13.784.
Was this talked about last week?
Let's see. Yeah, I think that's possible. Let's look at that. Remember the notes down below. Let's take
CTC agenda almost 3 weeks ago. So, sorry, almost 4 weeks ago.
Okay, so the comment that we do have from Ben is that he couldn't make it and he hasn't had time to work on that. So he says it suggests taking off the agenda unless there's anything new to discuss. Discussed last time and not untag. So maybe the right answer is to just untag that for now. Does anybody have alternate suggestions, ideas? If not, I'm just going to untag it.
Particularly strongly about this. Guess we might as well take it back to GitHub then.
Right. Okay.
I think the strong feelings are in GitHub on this one.
Okay. So I've untagged it and we'll take it back to GitHub. And if it gets to the point, I think Ben is one of the people who's showing some concern, and his comment was he hasn't had enough time to properly continue the conversation. So maybe once that happens, it can come back to this agenda if necessary. Okay, any other comments on that one before we move to the next issue? Okay, the next one is stream remove writable readable state.length, and it's issue number 12857.
I suggest we have to skip this one too because the primary parties are Brian and Matteo, and neither of them are here.
Right. Okay, yeah, certainly that makes sense. I can see the last comment was from Matteo, so let's, any objections to skipping that or any comments or anything before we move on from that one? Nope. Okay, let's move on to the next item, which is clean up writable state and readable state access across the code base. That's number 445. And let's see if we can see who actually put that on the agenda. So again, this was Matteo. There are 2 weeks ago comments to review a couple of particular issues. Again, since Matteo isn't here, it maybe doesn't make sense to get into a lot of the details. Anybody comments, discussion that we should have on this?
So this one and the previous issue have been on the agenda for a while. I'm wondering if maybe they just should be pushed for vote on GitHub, because they just seem like they're going to keep on coming back. And also, they're very deeply technical, and the CTC has not been great at talking about streams or making decisions about streams in the past. It's more of a, the streams working group sort of deal with it. But I wonder if maybe we could encourage Matteo and or Brian to come up with a sort of a clear question for the CTC to answer, because otherwise it's just this sort of vague, have a look at streams thing.
Okay. So I'm just typing something into the issue as we speak. And it was Brian. Sorry, which Brian is involved? You said it was Matteo or
Brian White.
All right, so that's MCDX, right?
MSCDX.
Could come up. So what I've said is discussion in this week's meeting was whether MCalina or MSDX could come up with a clear question for the TSC that we can discuss and if necessary vote on. That makes sense to everybody as a representation of what we're talking about here? Any objections? I guess as taken as no objections, I'll put that comment in. If anybody else has alternate ideas or whatever, please jump into the GitHub issue itself. Right. So going back to the agenda, the next thing on the agenda is Node.js/VM. So this is drop -- nappy modules earlier than dropping the experimental status. The proposal here is to remove the command line option that's required to enable modules. But at the same time, if you do load a nappy module and an API module, there would be a warning emitted to basically tell you you're using an experimental feature. The discussion is actually, continued on. Instead of continuing the discussion in this particular issue, a PR was opened in the core node repo. That is number 14902. There was some discussion in there, and that there was one or two more breaking changes we were still looking at, and the request was that we burn through that list first before landing it. Otherwise, there hasn't really been any objections. It's one of the actions we did have was to, one of the things on that list was how it interacted with CS, with the new module, ES6 modules, and in terms of maybe making some changes now so that it's more generic as opposed to being tied to the existing CS module loader semantics, and sort of trying not to leak those out. So that there was some discussion on that, and there's a proposal that's factored into this into this as a PR number 15088. So I guess the fundamental question to the TSC originally was, and the reason it was brought here is that there has been differing opinions on whether an experimental feature absolutely must be guarded by a flag, or have emitting a message is enough in terms of the experimental feature. So I think that's the question: is do we agree we can remove the flag while it's still experimental, or not?
I mean, it sounds like there might be a decent amount of changes still planned. So unless we have some way of doing like, I don't know, almost like an NAPI version 2 at, I mean, or when it comes out of experimental, well, I mean, we still need to consider some amount of breakage then by the sounds of it. I mean, it sounds like it's maybe not as stable as I had originally thought.
Well,
I mean, if there's lots of breaking changes still likely to come fairly soon before it's like really good and usable, it might be better to keep it under the flag.
So
However, I mean, I'm kind of sympathetic to the idea that you know, probably we're not getting the usage and testing that we need with it flagged though. So
just to clarify a little bit, I think there's like 2 changes left. You know, there's and these changes, you know, because it's an experimental, they're ones that we're making. They don't have to be made, but they're ones we're making to make the API better. And the request was that we only remove the flag after we've completed that list.
Right.
So, you know,
I mean,
after that list is completed and we remove the flag, I think we're talking about treating as if it was frozen, even though it's still in experimental status.
So one of the trade-offs here is that, I mean, we would really like feedback from native module authors, and having it behind a flag make it really difficult for native module authors to jump on board with this. Right. So I like to compare it with async hooks. Like it was experimental, and we did change the API over a long term, but the fact that it was easily accessible meant that people could play with it. People could easily have a module that worked with it, even if it was experimental. I think people understand what experimental means, and I think having extra knobs, extra degrees of experimental is problematic. So a flag versus a flag plus experimental, I think adds complication. So, and I have this comment not just for this, for other features that are also experimental and also behind a flag, I see the same problem, such as HTTP2. We cannot get enough exposure and feedback from the community if we put it behind a flag. So we need that feedback before moving it out of experimental.
Right. When you say a flag and experimental, do you mean a flag and emitting a warning that it's experimental, or something different?
Yeah, so we seem to have 3 ways of stating something is experimental. One is we say it's experimental, it's documented as experimental. Then the other option we have is that we can print a warning additionally to saying it's experimental. And this is the third knob that we have. We say, in addition to the warning, we will also have this flag that basically guards it prevents people from using it. I don't think it helps.
Right. Any of those, or like, are you suggesting we just dock it and that's it?
I think the flag especially is problematic. The warning is somewhat problematic, but I think that I'm comfortable living with. In this particular case for an API, I think the flag is the one that basically is a big deal breaker for module authors, I would expect.
I mean, I certainly don't think that just documenting it is enough, because I mean, now we're stuck with both domains and cluster.
Yeah, it worked out fine for async hooks, I would argue.
Yeah. I mean,
and I would say that
it wasn't really documented at the same time. Also, maybe, I don't know. There's like lots of things to consider here. We should probably have like a maybe more solid thing. I'm not really against unflagging it. I think once said breaking changes are done, sounds like, you know, we'll get the feedback that we need more readily, at least for an API.
Any other people with comments or suggestions?
I agree with that. I do agree with Ali, though, about the flags. I feel like they definitely make it harder for the community to adopt.
it almost sounds like what we have here is
I
two
mean, that's
things.
intentional though, right? Sorry, go on.
I was sorry. No, I was just going to say, I think we almost have two things here. One, which is we might want to PR something against, we had something that talked about what experimental was. We might want to PR against that. If there might even be something that's in flight on that, and then separately, decide on this particular issue. One thing we could, one way we could handle it is, we have issue 14902. I don't think anybody has objected to it landing other than myself. Just, I put a blocking thing saying we need to work through the list first. But, one thing we could say is, okay, it doesn't sound like anybody's objecting, but if you want to, that's the place to do it. And then separately deal with the larger issue of, do we think we should just change our policy in terms of whether flags are needed at all or not?
I mean, I think they're still good to have during the initial period. I mean, there's kind of like a period I feel where, I mean, we might have something that's like fairly well working, but we probably want to kind of get used to it ourselves and get a bit of a feel of it for ourselves to make sure that it's something that we think we can collectively maintain long term and doesn't have any obvious oversight after like a couple months that someone didn't really think about and that kind of thing. I mean, the kind of point of the flags always was to basically hinder use until like this extra baseline is done, where we're like, okay, we're actually okay with adding a new module or an entirely new native layer or something like that.
Right. So maybe our wording, our wording could reflect, I think our wording could reflect that, it may be useful, but not mandatory based on what you've just said, right?
I mean, I think it should probably be mandatory at first, like even for a couple of releases at minimum. Not major releases, just like so some people can use it, and then if nothing terrible turns up, we can release it more to the wild. I don't know, from maintaining a platform, a slightly staged rollout just seems like a better idea, especially considering the past.
So, but maybe we should take that discussion offline.
Agreed.
And open an issue, have an issue where we can have that discussion to pull it to its conclusion, and if we need to bring it back. In terms of the specific case of NAPI, is it reasonable to say that, like, I don't hear, and correct me if I'm wrong, I don't hear anybody objecting to saying, in the case of NAPI, once that list is burned down, we remove the flag. So is it reasonable to say that, the outcome of this discussion was that, there's, once that list is burned down, the PR can land. If anybody does object, they will jump into 14902 to discuss it there.
I mean, I personally think so. I'm going to update my comment because I think this is reasonable once those changes have been done.
Anybody else?
I mean, that being said, we might want to still have it in like one release after those changes are done. But yes, I'll leave a comment on that.
Okay. Anybody else have any comments or suggestions? Okay, if not, that's what I'll post. I'll post that into the actual PR itself, and I will remove the CTC agenda from the item in the VM. And actually, I think we can probably close it with the discussion carrying on and being in the VM, in the PR and the Node repo, which is broader visibility anyway. So. Okay, going back to the agenda. That's the issues that we had on the agenda itself. Any other issues that people want to bring on to the into the discussion for this week? No, okay. Well, I think in that case, we'll call it for this week in terms of the meeting. And I think that's it. Maybe we can stop the streaming. Sorry, I guess before we do that, we usually ask for questions.
Yeah, so if anyone has questions, either post them in Node.dev on IRC or the YouTube live chat. We'll wait a couple minutes to answer those. I've already solicited for those, but yeah. Maybe we could read off the upcoming meeting. Yes,
I'm just opening the calendar to look for that. So I'm looking, there's August, I think September. So I see, okay, where are we? The next Node.js CTC meeting, TSC meeting now is scheduled for September 13th at 1 p.m. Although that doesn't sound quite right to me, so I'll have to double check. But the coming up in the September, the week of September 3rd, I see on Thursday the Node Security Working Group meeting. We have the Node TSC meeting, but with the merger back together, that likely won't happen, just being assumed by the CTC meeting. And that's all that I see on the calendar right now.
Okay.
So are there any questions?
From YouTube live chat, Yanong asks, what are the responsibilities of the chair and director of the now merged TSC?
So I guess in I'll give you my best representation. They are captured in the charter and some of the TSC guidance documentation in the repo. So I'd suggest reading there to get the fully authoritative list. In broad strokes, the TSC director is responsible for representing the TSC at the board members and basically interacting with the board in terms of acting as the interface between the board and the TSC and everything that goes with that. The TSC chair is responsible for scheduling meetings, making sure that agendas are available ahead of time, that we have notes that are published. And I think those are the things that are sort of formally listed out. And then together, they are responsible for the sort of trying to keep the TSC running as smoothly as possible. Anybody else have things to add to that?
Oh, go on, if anyone has anything. I think the main difference now will be that the TSC will discuss topics that previously were left to the CTC. Basically share that oversight of core a little bit more closely. It is also essentially comprised of what was mostly the CTC anyways, though. So mostly the same people.
Right. I mean, the very short history is that there was only the TSC at one point. For reasons that made sense at the time, the CTC was split out, and so that we ended up with a separate TSC and CTC. Some of the assumptions on which that split was based didn't actually come to fruition. So at this point, they've been merged back together, and we're kind of back to where we were when the foundation governance was first established. Any other additions to that? Any other questions?
Yep. So Saishun asks, what about CTC issue 165, which is also listed on our agenda. That is the ROD issue.
Right. That was the first issue that we dealt with. You know, what we believe as a group is, at least the group that's here today, we don't actually have, I'd have to count to see if we actually have quorum. But, you know, what we've agreed is that we will open up a document where we can, you know, collaborate together on what we think possible next steps and options are, and, you know, work on that together to come up with, you know, how we're going to handle that particular request. So you know, we're not at the point where we've got consensus or a clear direction on, you know, the process and, you know, how we're going to take to conclusions. So the first thing we're going to do is to discuss that and the options that go along with it.
As Shaka mentioned in the chat, a bunch of people have joined, so we might have quorum, actually. No?
I don't operate by quorum though, so I doubt that without discussion in a more appropriate media, like a document, when we can organize things, we can all agree on a resolution right now. Or I mean that I doubt that at least half of the people on the TSC would be able to agree on some solution right now without previous discussion.
Yeah, I'm certainly in agreement with that. Both, you know, I don't think we'd have a clear consensus on the way forward. And I think, you know, this is an issue where we need to, even if we have quorum, you know, our consensus seeking model is that first we need to try and reach consensus before we would call a vote or anything like that. So even though we have quorum and could vote, I don't think it's appropriate yet.
Also, as we don't operate by quorum, it's even the fact that we have something that we can call a quorum doesn't mean that even voting right now will result in anything.
Agreed.
Yeah, I wasn't suggesting that. I was just noting.
Yep. Nope. Understood. Any other questions? Okay. Well, I think then if we've don't have any additional questions, let's call the meeting for today.
All right. Thanks for watching and joining in, everyone.